Also, what he had written in this booklet, it was initially an article, really represented a breakthrough in economic theory, which demonstrated that, or the necessity and nature of the price system in allocating resources. Okay, for once, we had a clear idea of why it was important to society, to civilization even, to have a price system. And third, he presented what I'll explain later as a theory of economic calculation, okay, which demonstrates basically how the qualitative data of subjective values, which are individual and subjective to each individual, how they are transformed into the cardinal data of objective prices that we see all around us, so that entrepreneurs can calculate profits and losses. How is this transformation brought about? Well, Mises shows this. Now, let me just talk a little about the debate over socialism before Mises wrote this article. The debate was started with utopian socialists, who are at the top, Charles Fourier, Henri Saint-Simon, two Frenchmen, and then I believe a Scotsman named Robert Owen. And each one of them had a different plan on how to reorganize society. They treated society as men on a chessboard that they could simply move around. Let me, for example, mention what Fourier said about social reorganization. Fourier was basically crazy. He believed that the perfect size of a small socialist community, or a socialist community, should be organized in small groups of 160, okay, which sort of was a throwback to the Roman phalanxes, okay, in which the Roman soldiers fought. So he thought this was the perfect number. Why? I don't know. He also believed that once you had socialism, you would have a change in the natural world too. Okay, socialism was going to be productive, not only going to be just, but much more productive than capitalist society. He made statements like, such as the following: the oceans will turn to lemonade. Okay, he said that. Chickens already roasted would fly into people's mouths, and the lions would allow you to ride them. Okay, so he was nuts. And the others also had these ridiculous schemes to transform human society as if it was clay, to just mold it into something that was patterned after a vision in their fevered brains. Well, it was pretty easy for the classical economists to smash this nonsense. Remember, they were not perfect, but they did have the law of supply and demand, and they were able to show that the proposals put forth by the utopian socialists would fail. And one of the things that they pointed out was the so-called who will take out the garbage problem. In other words, if everybody gets compensated according to their needs, okay, and works according to their ability, then who would have an incentive to do the dirty jobs, to have to get up early and take out other people's garbage, or to go down deep in coal mines to mine coal and bring it to the surface? Who would do the dirty, dangerous, unhealthy jobs in society? The utopian socialists responded, well, there'll be a new socialist man. Okay, this guy swimming in lemonade and eating chickens. this guy, okay, which was a pretty poor response to all of this. That this new socialist man would develop and would not work any longer for profit, but just for the satisfaction of working for his fellow men and women. Both sides, by the way, believe that if the incentive problem could be solved, then capitalism, or rather socialism, could be as productive as capitalism. That wasn't debated. The rest of the debate took place on justice, whether it was just or unjust for society or the collective to seize the private property in factories and machinery and so on. Now, Karl Marx comes onto the scene, a so-called or self-proclaimed scientific socialist. And what Marx did was a brilliant rhetorical ploy. Okay? What he said was the following. He knew the utopian socialists were nuts and they were doing harm to the socialist cause. And they were just, their schemes were just laughable. So what he said was the following. No one can predict what the future state of socialism will look like. To try to do so means that you're unscientific. We can't debate about what it's going to look like. Why? Because it's going to come with the inevitability of the laws of nature. Just as the feudal society replaced the classical slave society of Greece and Rome, and just as the industrial society of capitalism replaced the feudal society, so will in the future the socialist society replace capitalism, and then eventually we would have full communism. But we can never ask about the next stage. It's just not worth arguing about because it's going to come about in any case, no matter what we say. Right? So he shut everybody up because nobody wanted to be called unscientific. And that's where the debate stood before Mises. And what Mises did, as we'll see, was to question the the implicit assumption that, well, if you could solve this incentive problem of who takes out the garbage, socialism could work. It could be as productive as capitalism. So what was Mises' thesis? Let's start with what he said. Mises said and meant that a socialist economy is impossible. Okay? He used the word impossible, actually the German equivalent of impossible, which I can't pronounce, so I won't try to say it and embarrass myself. But his thesis was this, that the rational allocation of resources, of deciding what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, how much of all goods to produce, that rational allocation of resources is impossible without economic calculation using actual market prices. And he went on to say, socialism abolishes the economic or the foundations of economic calculation, okay, or the institutional preconditions of economic calculation. Economic calculation can only take place with certain social institutions in existence. And what were these social institutions? Mises enumerated them. He says, first, there has to be private property, not just in consumer goods, which most socialists were willing to agree to, but there also has to be private property in capital goods, in all orders of producer goods, meaning all natural resources as well as all capital goods in every stage of production. Secondly, there had to be a complete freedom to exchange all types of goods and services so that you do have prices. And third, there has to be sound money, okay, a money whose value is independent of political influence. Now look at what does socialism do? Okay, there's actually a great book that was written on socialism in the 1860s by an economist who was sort of sympathetic to socialism. His name was Albert Scheffler, and it was called The Quintessence of Socialism. And he went through all the plans of the many socialists. And he came to the conclusion that the one thing that unified all these plans was a hatred and a desire to abolish private property. Okay? And that's exactly what socialism does, right? It collectivizes all the means of production, all the non-human means of production, meaning all the capital goods and all the natural resources are owned. They like to say collectively, but we know they're owned by a monopoly called the state. So they want to concentrate ownership into one entity that we call the state. Now, if you do that, if you have one entity, okay, one monopolist that owns all the factors of production, can there be any exchange? Mises says, of course not. The owner can't exchange with himself. If there's no exchange, there's no market prices. If there are no market prices, there's no way to calculate profits and losses, revenues and costs. No way to have economic calculation, to know what goods are most valuable to consumers. Okay. And also, of course, socialism abolishes, by implication, the freedom to exchange these producers' goods, okay, because one entity owns them. And socialism abolishes money. Okay. They do have what might be called a form of money, vouchers for consumer goods that you get when you work. The worker does get paid and can purchase consumer goods, and there are, in some sense, prices in terms of this pseudo money for labor, but there are no prices for anything else. So this was Mises' thesis, that without economic calculation, you cannot have an economy, meaning an allocation of resources that meaningfully reflects the most, or meaningfully brings about a pattern of production that produces the most valuable goods from the point of view of the consumers of those goods. Or even from the point of view of the planner himself. Okay? He can't even if he were to decide, if all you people are sort of my pawns, and I'm the socialist planner, even if I said, you know what, I don't care what your preferences are, I'm going to decide how to use these resources, all the resources, let's say, that are available in the United States, as an example. I wouldn't know how to bring about the complicated allocation of these resources in a way that even satisfies my most valuable ends. Okay, and we'll talk about that in more detail. So let's cut right to the chase, and let me show you what I mean when I say that socialism cannot calculate. And then we'll go back over some other aspects of Mises' argument and look at the Soviet Union. Okay, here's a typical problem that a socialist planner might face. Now, forget about the handwritten items that are in blue there. Just concentrate on what's typewritten there. Okay, this is a production function for an automobile. Mises never said that the socialist planner cannot obtain the necessary technological information, the necessary engineering skills, and so on. He says that they could easily hire boards of scientists and engineers and get all the information necessary for a sophisticated technological plan for producing any good. So that's not the problem. Technical knowledge is not the problem. So let's say the socialist planner is deciding whether or not to produce another automobile plant and to produce a batch of additional automobiles with a certain amount of inputs. And he knows these inputs from his scientists and engineers. He knows that for any given automobile, it takes P tons of steel added to Q hours of machine time, plus R hours of unskilled labor, and then a certain number of hours of engineering labor. Let me put the suffix for the people in the back. And then T square feet of factory space, certain amount of kilowatt hours of electricity, and then V hours of managerial labor. And of course, there are many hundreds of other inputs that go in. I'm simplifying enormously here. And you come out with one automobile. Okay, so he knows how to produce the automobile, as well as GM. Well, GM doesn't know how to produce automobiles, but as well as any company in a capitalist economy can produce. Okay, from the technological point of view. The question becomes that he has to ask himself and answer, should he produce these automobiles? Should he produce the automobiles or not? In other words, all of these items, these inputs, are scarce. Steel is scarce. It can be used in bicycles and construction. The same is true of machine time and all the different types of labor that's needed. They all have alternative uses that can yield valuable products. Okay? How does he know that this is the most valuable use of that package of resources? Well, he doesn't know the price of the automobile. There are no prices. Or even if there was a price for the automobile, even if it was, let's say, 10,000 labor tickets or something that you get for 10,000 hours of labor time, he can't figure out his cost of production. That's the key point. He doesn't know what his costs of production are. Okay? And these reflect the value of the alternative uses. How do you add up tons of steel with hours of unskilled labor, with square feet of factory space, with kilowatt hours of electricity, and so on? How do you add those things up? They're apples and oranges. You can't add them up. You cannot come up with a unitary figure for cost of production. So you're completely blind as to which to produce, okay? As to whether or not to produce this at all. But also we know that not only are there's 70,000 items in a typical supermarket, okay? So imagine that. I mean, in an economy as complex as the US economy, there are millions of items if you take space into consideration and you include all producers' goods. So all these things, most of these things can be used in a multitude of alternative ways. Are we using each of these things in its most valuable use? That's one problem. Should we do it at all? But a second problem is, let's say he decides to do it. Well, there are many, many ways to produce any given good, many different technologies. And now you can look at hours of machine time. Let's say you can produce it as a Japanese plant might produce it. That is, you don't just use Q hours of machine time, you add A amount of hours. That is, you turn it into almost a completely robotical plant, okay? With robots assembling the automobiles. And you subtract unskilled labor, okay? You subtract B, unskilled labor. Is that a good technical decision? Is that going to lower your cost? You don't know, right? It depends. It depends on scarcities of labor, scarcities of the substitutes for labor, and so on. Let me give you a personal example. I have a friend who I've known since childhood who married a cowboy, actually, a real one, from Montana, and moved to Montana and lives on a big ranch there. And one day, we were talking on the phone, she called me up, and she said, I'm getting a new house. I said, oh, you're moving off the ranch? She says, no, we're having a new house shipped in. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, the other house is too small, so we're getting a 5-bedroom house. I said, yeah, but that's not the part that I don't understand. The part that I don't understand is, where's this house coming from? She says, well, people in Montana don't have the houses built on site. They have them built in factories in Nebraska, shipped on railroads and then on trucks to the site and then assembled. Well, why would that be? Well, she says it's much cheaper that way. So why is it much cheaper that way? Well, because there's about 10 people in Montana, right? So labor is very scarce and the price of labor is high and you need those guys for the cattle drives. And she actually has been on cattle drives, does have them, and so on. So what do? You use a lot more machinery, you use a lot more capital goods, you use a big factory, and you use a lot of railroad capacity and truck capacity, and then use a few guys on site, because they're so expensive, to assemble that. So entrepreneurs in a market economy know how to calculate. Okay, now, would some Russian planner ever figure this out? That you should build the house, I don't know, I don't even know where Montana is, but let's say 1,000 miles away in Nebraska. There's no way that seems intuitively correct. But intuition isn't enough. You need economic calculation. Which brings me back to the example of this. At every moment in time in a capitalist economy, everything has a price because everything is exchanged. So steel has a price, unskilled labor has a price. Electricity has a price. Everything has a price. So the entrepreneur has no problem with calculating his costs of production. So let's say the automobile sells for $21,000 and the cost of production is $18,000. What that tells us is that the alternative uses of those goods are less valuable than using it as an automobile. Okay, not only is that what it reveals, but it also gives the entrepreneurs an incentive to go ahead and build that automobile. Now, remember, entrepreneurs react, and we'll talk about this in my lecture tomorrow for those who attend it, on entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs react not to present prices, they react to future anticipated prices. Can entrepreneurs make mistakes? Well, yes, GM made a big mistake. Okay, GM has lost billions and billions of dollars, so has AIG, and so on. I mentioned that in my lecture yesterday. So, it might be the case that the price of this automobile does not turn out to be $21,000 because that price is only anticipated. At the end of the assembly process, next year, this new model is going to sell for $21,000, and you're spending $18,000 on resources. It may be $16,000, the automobile. That is, supply and demand might be such that the equilibrium price is $16,000, in which case you've made a mistake. But at least you understand that you've made a mistake. A socialist planner would just go on and produce the automobiles and not know whether or not a mistake has been made. Okay? So in this sense, socialism cannot calculate. Now, one thing that Mises did not say, some people say, well, you know, you don't need calculation in all types of economies and so on. Well, Mises said, look, in very small economies, in a Robinson Crusoe economy, we have an isolated individual, or in a small family, or in a small tribe or household, you can get along with economic calculation. Not very well, but you can get along with economic calculation. We have very few capital goods, and your basic input is your labor. And let me see if I have, yeah, here's an example of what I wanted to show you. So this is Robinson Crusoe's value scale, okay? He has 16 hours of labor. That's really the only scarce good on this island that he needs to conserve, okay? And he's going to use it in chunks of 4 hours. So let's say he ranks the goods that he can obtain for 4 hours in the following way, okay? Coconuts, fish, okay? 4 hours of fishing will yield him 2 fish. 4 hours of picking mushrooms will yield him 3 pounds of mushrooms. 1 sack of berries. Actually, this should be 12 hours up here, not 16. Okay, so he has 12 hours to allocate, okay? And so let's say he's initially serving his first three ends, okay? So he's using it to produce coconuts, fish, and mushrooms, okay? That's his value scale. Now, the point is, let's say he finds out that there are rabbits or some other kind of game on the island, and he'd like to vary his diet and have meat, okay? Does he know the cost of taking those 4 hours and using them to obtain meat? Okay. Well, if the least valuable use of those 12 hours of labor is the 3 pounds of mushrooms, then that becomes the opportunity cost. Okay? If he wants to take 4 hours away from what he's presently doing and shift it to another area of production, then whatever the other area of production is has to yield him something that has greater value than the opportunity cost. Okay? Giving up the lowest valued good of what he's currently producing, and let's say it's the mushrooms. So if the rabbit, if having this meat is worth more than that, okay, directly, subjectively to him, he can then go and hunt, and it will be the correct decision. If it's worth less, well then he will forego the, hunting for the rabbit. Now you can't do this in a socialist economy because you have much more complicated production processes. Okay, there are a variety of types of labor. Okay, let's say in the Soviet Union, a variety of types of goods that can be produced. Almost an infinity of ways of using labor. If you think about the U.S. economy and you put yourself in charge of the U.S. economy, what would you produce? Okay, there are so many different ways to combine the different resources that are available in the U.S. economy, the millions of different goods, and you don't have prices to guide you because you're the sole planner, you're the owner of all this stuff. You would not be able to make a rational decision. This is Mises' point. Mises' point is that outside the simple household economy, if you do not have economic calculation, you are like a man in a desert without a compass. You don't know which way to go. And this is why, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed, okay? And other centrally planned economies. I'll get to, we'll talk about in a moment why the Soviet Union actually lasted for 70 years or so. So to go back to Mises' point, he concludes that a socialist economy is literally impossible because it cannot calculate the opportunity cost of production and investment decisions. Okay? As I've shown you with the automobile example. Let me give you an example of the Soviet Union. There was a famine that struck the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And yet, there were tractors that were rusting in the fields of grain that was unharvested. Okay? And there were empty silos. So you had a lot of the goods available, right? However, there were no laborers, because they were being employed in factories that were producing more tractors, which were sitting and rusting in the fields. Okay? So because of this, it's a machine that turns but to no effect. They kept producing steel that they kept adding in. The CIA, by the way, thought that the Soviet economy was a powerhouse. And I mean, but what they were doing was they were adding up things like rusting tractors or tractors they were producing that had no use, or just steel that was piling up unused, and they were adding it into their gross domestic product or their gross national product at the time. Okay, but these things are just a complete waste of resources. Right? Now they had something called gross output planning. This is the way they tried to plan the Soviet economy. Let me see if I have the word right now for you. The planning agency, there. Okay, planning agency was Gosplan, and they had a technique called gross output planning. And what this was the following. What they did was they set, for each industry, quantitative targets. There was no price data, so they set quantitative targets. You had to produce so many chandeliers. You had to produce so many tractors. You had to produce so many building nails, and so on. And then each industry had its own minister then that assigned the individual firms in that industry a gross output target. Now, if you met the target or exceeded it, you got a bonus. If you didn't meet the target, you got an all expense paid vacation in the gulag. Okay, but you didn't want to exceed the target too much. You didn't want too big a bonus because it was based on a system of mutual lying, of course. Because if you exceeded your target by 20%, what do you think would happen to your target next year? Go up by 20%. I mean, either way, you're going to the gulag. Because eventually they're going to, so you got to lie. You can't be too greedy and get your bonuses right away. Okay, even if you could exceed it by 20%, you might only exceed it by 2 or 3% or something like that. Okay. What was interesting was that there was a shortage of roofing nails that was widely reported. That is, there were a lot of houses that were built in the Soviet Union and commercial buildings that had no roofs on them. The reason was that the nail targets, the building nail targets, were stated in terms of tons. So what's the easiest way to fulfill your target? Make very big nails, okay? Roofing nails have to be small, all right? So there was a joke, a cartoon in one of the Soviet newspapers I try to reproduce here. Okay, this is the commissar. You know, he's got one of those furry hats on it the Russians wear. Okay, this is the manager of the plant. This is a train. This is his output for the year. Builds this giant nail and says, "Well, comrade, I met my target," because that was the cheapest way to meet your target, the easiest way to meet your target. Okay. There was also Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier in the 1950s into the early 60s, made a very cryptic remark attacking the chandelier industry during one of his economic speeches. And it turns out, with a little more digging, they found out that the chandeliers were being made very heavy, with a lot of lead in the glass and so on. And they were pulling down the ceilings of they call dashas, the houses on the Black Sea that the party apparatchiks got to live in, and killing a lot of the comrades because they were so heavy. And that, of course, was not a good thing, and so Khrushchev was chastising these people for that. But of course, even if they then tried to introduce quality considerations, it's very difficult to introduce quality considerations into all of this. Because then you have so many dimensions for the plan that it becomes very hard to figure out if the guy's actually meeting it or not. Okay, so you had this crazy, situation in which the wrong things were being produced. You had mutual lying. You had buildings being unfinished, and so on. You had women in Russia, small women, petite women, and children didn't have any clothes, or they had to wear clothes that were too big because it was in terms of yards of cloth, the target for clothing. So big Russian women were, easily fitted, okay, plus size. But petite women had problems finding any kind of clothes. And that's why there was such a great black market in American jeans and other kinds of American clothing during the 1980s there, okay? At least they fit. And there was a joke that was often told about when Western economists met their Soviet and Eastern Bloc counterparts, The joke was, well, it goes back to something that Khrushchev said when he was in the gave a talk in the United Nations. He famously took off his shoe and banged it on the table and said, "We will bury you," to the West. And so the Soviet economists, when they would meet with Western economists, would say, "We're going to bury you economically, but we're going to leave Hong Kong so that we can copy their prices." Because it turns out, what the Soviet Union was doing was actually copying Western prices. Now, they weren't prices that reflected their particular conditions of scarcity, but they were at least some prices that gave them an idea of how to at least crudely calculate, okay? Now, many people say that Mises' impossibility theory is falsified by the fact that the Soviet Union lasted for 70 years. But Mises already answered that objection in his first article. He said, the present Soviet Union, 1920 he knew this, he said, the present Soviet Union isn't a true socialist economy. It's more like the post office in the middle of a capitalist economy, right? The post office is terribly, terribly inefficient, okay? Was even worse before you had the growth of FedEx and UPS and so on. Terribly inefficient, but they could crudely calculate. I mean, they did get the mail delivered, it took a long time and so on, but they got the mail delivered. So Mises' point was that the Soviet Union was using prices from the world economy. They were engaged in selling gold and selling coal and selling electricity abroad and getting hard currency, so they had some prices there. For example, there's a story about the People's Republic of China in the 1950s ordering Sears, tremendous numbers of Sears catalogs to try to use them in their planning agencies. There was a system called BLAT, B-L-A-T, a system of mutual bribery in which if a manager of a plant needed, let's say he needed more lumber of a certain type, and he had an excess of nails or whatever, he would hire a broker, or you'd have one working for him that would go and there would be exchanges, okay? So there was a system of these bribed prices. There was also black markets were cropping up, in agricultural goods, and in the 1980s, and in, as I said, Beatles records, jeans, and so on. So the authorities didn't crack down on them. They actually allowed these markets to flourish so they could see the prices, okay, and copy them, okay. So Mises pointed out that the only real period of true communism was the war communism period, which went from 1917 to 1921. It was during those 4 years that Lenin tried to actually abolish all prices, all accounting, and to do things simply with just looking at quantities of different things without having a common unit of calculation. And what happened was everything broke down. The cities were emptied out, just like they were under Pol Pot in Cambodia, because what happened was that there wasn't any firewood left. So people began burning their furniture, then parts of their house. And all the stores didn't have any food. So the economy degenerated into what socialism will always degenerate into. Small tribal economies, basically people grouped together, getting out of the cities, just preying on the countryside, trying to find wild game or expropriating what farms were left and so on. So socialism basically devolves into a capital-less, having absolutely no capital. They destroy all their capitalism, all their capital, because they can't calculate what capital goods to produce, which ones to allow to depreciate and not produce anymore, and so on. Okay. It was at that point that Lenin reinstituted what's called the new economic policy, in which he allowed private property in small plots of land and in small retail outlets and so on, to get the economy moving again. So it was a movement back towards capitalism. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the socialist response to Mises' argument. Actually, before I do so, I want to just say a few words about what Mises calls the intellectual division of labor. Let me see if I have it here. And we might also call it the social appraisement process. What Mises points out is this. Look, you cannot impute subjective values back to capital goods, back to labor resources in a complex industrial economy. You have to have prices, okay? There has to be a way of obtaining or generating cardinal data that is meaningful market prices that can be used to calculate profit, loss, and so on, to decide which investments should be undertaken, which investments should be avoided. So Mises called this appraisement, okay? It's different from you and I valuing like this clock or this computer, okay? That's a direct valuation. If we want to trade money for this computer, we'd simply make a direct valuation of how much utility the computer yields us, and on the other hand, how much utility we could get from spending this money on some other alternative, okay? It's more complicated than that when it comes to trying to find out what is the value of all those inputs that went into producing that computer. You can't figure it out by trying to value each one individually, as I showed you. You need prices. You need the theory of marginal productivity. Marginal productivity can only operate in a market economy. So here's basically what happens. We're all involved in the intellectual division of labor as consumers, producers, and entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs play the key role. Okay, so you have the entrepreneur in the middle. You have, what is he looking at? Now the entrepreneur, let's say Bill Gates, Ray Kroc, who was the one who started McDonald's, Stephen Jobs, all of these people, they're not looking at what anybody's doing today. They're not looking at the market today. They're starting from that point and they're using it as experience. What are they looking at? They're looking at what people will pay for the product they're thinking about producing at some point in the future. Could be 5 years or 10 years in the future. Remember, in 1980, the president of IBM, I think it was Bob Watson, made the statement that IBM had the technology for personal computers, okay? But they didn't get involved initially in producing personal computers. And the reason why was because Watson made the following statement. He said that personal computers will just be a household toy in which people will play games, okay? They will never be widely used in business, right? Stephen Jobs thought otherwise, okay, and started up Apple, and then there were some other companies that began emulating him and producing personal computers. Okay, he produced the Mac. His judgment of the future was right, but there were no personal computers when he made the decision to begin producing them. So what he's looking at is prices in the future. He's taking present trends and trying to appraise. Each entrepreneur tries to appraise what the price of the consumer good they're producing will be in the future, okay? And they're better or worse at it. Now, on what basis do they do this? They do look at the present prices and market conditions, but they also have to project them into the future. And this is the sort of ineffable, meaning unspeakable or we can't articulate it, element of entrepreneurship in the sense that it's based on someone's individual personality, what they see about the future that the rest of us do not see. And this is what separates a class of entrepreneurs in a real flesh and blood sense from the rest of us, okay? They're better at appraising prices of different goods, some of which do not even exist today in the future, than the rest of us, okay? But then what do? They have to have resources. So all these entrepreneurs, no matter what they're producing, have to bid. Okay, so you have social appraisement and competitive bidding. They all bid for labor and steel and engineering skills and software and the millions of other inputs, so that at the end of the day, the prices of all the inputs, okay, every input has a price, and that price reflects what the whole body of entrepreneurs believe will be their value at some point in the future when the consumer good is finally completed and sold on the market. Okay? So what do we have? At every moment in time, we have a whole structure of prices. Some of those prices are wrong. Some entrepreneurs, those that run GM, AIG, and so on, will have made mistakes and will go out of business or will have to cut back tremendously. Others will be able to expand their business, will be able to buy up other businesses, and so on. Okay? But the whole thing is that this structure of prices is social. Anybody can, if you want to know whether or not you can produce anything or whether or not it's profitable to produce anything, you can use the prices of today for the various inputs. Okay? You know what you'll have to pay for all these different inputs, and then compare it to what you expect to pay in the future. So the price system is a true social phenomenon in the sense that all of us contribute to it in our roles as consumers or resource owners or even as entrepreneurs, but not one of us can create it out of our heads, okay? We all contribute to it as individuals. This is a true social phenomenon. So the social appraisement process basically takes subjective values of consumers, transforms them through entrepreneurial appraisement and bidding into real cardinal prices that can be used to calculate profit and loss. This is Hayek called it a marvel. Okay, this is the marvel of the price system. Okay, people sometimes misattribute this to him and say that he called it a miracle, but it is also a miracle in some sense. It's something new under the sun. It's something new that's created not by any one person, but by this intellectual division of labor of all human beings. Okay, now let me get to the criticisms of Mises made by the socialists. They did respond, but they did realize immediately that this was one of the most important articles ever written attacking socialism. Initially, it only appeared in German, so the initial opponents of Mises were German economists, and the state of German economics at the time was very, very low. I mean, a lot of these guys were really stupid. It was the influence of the German historical school, which was anti-theoretical. The first criticism was, well, why do we need prices for? We can just do our accounting in natura, meaning in kind. Okay, so there was actually a fanatical Marxist, Otto Neurath, who said we can account in terms of tons of steel. We can have accounting in terms of tons of steel, kilowatts of electricity, and so on. Okay, well, he doesn't even know the grade school lesson that you can't add apples and oranges. All right, so Mises easily refuted him. In fact, he refuted a lot of these guys in advance in the 1920 article, even before they attacked him. Some Marxists who are a little bit more sophisticated said, but we do have something that's a common unit, and that is not money. That's labor hours. So we'll calculate in labor hours. Again, Mises refuted this very easily. He pointed out that, first of all, labor itself is not homogeneous, right? You can't compare, let's say, the labor of a McDonald's cashier to the labor of a software engineer to the labor of a brain surgeon. You can't compare, even in the same industry, you can't compare, let's say, Kobe Bryant and his labor hour, his 48 minutes of playing basketball with the 48 minutes given to you by the 12th man on the bench, okay? So even in the same, so these hours are heterogeneous. They really can't be added up. The only similarity between them is semantical. We call them labor hours. But really, to be precise, they're hours of labor of an engineer, hours of labor of a basketball player, and so on. And you have to remember that even the engineers have different quality of labor and so on. Secondly, it leaves out the contribution of capital. Okay? Obviously, labor that works with more capital is much more productive than labor that works with less capital. The reason why the U.S. has a much higher standard of living, let's say, than someone in Taiwan, even though people in Taiwan might work just as hard as the U.S. workers, is because we have more capital per laborer. Okay? Our laborers work with more capital and more highly sophisticated forms of capital than do laborers in Taiwan. So capital is scarce and has to have a price. Right? So, and this leaves that out of account. And of course, land is left out of account. So Mises destroyed this objection to his thesis. Finally, some economists, socialist economists, thought they would be very clever, and they said, look, what we're going to do is we're just going to expropriate the owners and the stockholders. We're going to leave the managers where they are. We're going to leave everybody where they are and just tell them, keep doing what you're doing. Okay? Well, first of all, how does that make socialism more productive than capitalism? It certainly doesn't, number one. But number two, that would only be the correct solution if nothing ever changed, if people's tastes never changed, if new technology was never introduced, if new deposits of minerals and oil and so on were never found. Okay? Once you allow change, you have to completely revolutionize the economy. You have to keep changing the capital goods you produce, the consumer goods you produce, the technology you use. All right? And that's where you have an economic problem. If everything tomorrow is like everything today, there is no economic problem. You just do the same thing over and over and over again. But then people are simply just robots or automatons. Okay? So this whole idea that you can just do what capitalism does, but we can take away the unjust income from the stockholders and the owners and so on, that's nonsense. Because that presupposes a static economy in which nothing ever changes. Right? So Mises completely destroyed the early critics of his position. Right? The more sophisticated critics were the neoclassically trained economists, some of whom were socialists, but they were neoclassical economists also, who responded in the 1930s after his article was translated into English and put into a collection of works criticizing socialism that was edited by F.A. Hayek, Mises' follower. So there were a number of economists that proposed a mathematical solution to the problem of economic calculation. In fact, this was actually proposed before Mises wrote by two mathematical economists, Vilfredo Pareto and Enrico Barone, neither of whom really were socialists. And basically, they came to the conclusion that, yes, if you had a very small economy, you could come up with these equations of supply and demand for each economy, where supply and demand depends not only on the price of the product, but on the price of all products. So it's a system of simultaneous equations that has to be solved. In the pre-computer age, it was very time-consuming to solve these systems, okay? So in the late 1800s, these two mathematical economists came up with this, and I wanted to give you the statement that one made. Let's see if I have it here. Yeah. This was Enrico Barone in 1908, 12 years before Mises wrote, and 22 years before these neoclassical economists came up with this. He said, but it is frankly inconceivable that the economic determination of the technical coefficients can be made a priori in such a way as to satisfy I'll read from here, the condition of the minimum cost of production, which is an essential condition for obtaining that maximum to which we have referred. This economic variability of the technical coefficients is certainly neglected by the collectivists, but it is one of the most important sides of the question Pareto has already very clearly shown in one of his many ingenious contributions to the science. It is on this account that the equations of the equilibrium with maximum collective welfare are not soluble a priori on paper. That is, you have to solve it by the market. And what he meant by the coefficients is the differences in technology that could be used. So it was already refuted even before Mises, okay? But basically, these other British economists came up with this solution. And other economists came up with something called the trial and error method, which was a little bit more sophisticated than this solution. And they were, three were, one an American management theorist named Fred Taylor, a Polish neoclassically trained socialist named Oskar Lange, and a British economist named Abel Lerner. And what they said was the following: let's set up a collective planning board, central planning board, and they'll direct managers of the firms with very simple rules. They'll give them 3 rules. They'll say, look, first of all, make your input and output decisions based on prices that we're going to set. So they're going to initially set arbitrary prices for steel, for rubber, for all the various kinds of chemicals, for everything. Okay. based on these prices, what you should do is you should minimize your cost of production. Okay? And third, every firm should be given a quantity of output to produce so that in that industry, all firms have the same cost of production. Right? Now, how are they going to operate this system? What they were going to do was they were going to set arbitrary prices. If there was a surplus, then they would know the price is too high and they would lower the price. If there was a shortage, if there was a greater demand than supply, they would know that the price is too low and they'd raise the price. Okay? And eventually they claimed that there would be the establishment of a competitive equilibrium. Okay? Now, they actually talked about this, but they always fell back on the fact that this will be a solution, like a mathematical solution. And the first people who attacked this were followers of Mises, Hayek and Lionel Robbins, a British economist. But first of all, remember, with the mathematical solution and with this sort of false competitive solution that they're proposing, they were retreating from their original claim. The original claim was socialism will be more, not only more just, but more productive than capitalism. But they're already saying that we need prices. They're already admitting we need prices, whether they're generated mathematically or they're generated by this process of this sort of game that you're playing with telling managers to do certain things when you make up these prices. They're still made up prices. They're not real prices. It's like a child's game. Okay. So here's what Hayek and Robbins said. They said, first of all, the economic data that they need for their equations is so spread out that it will be extremely time-consuming to get it to the planners, to put into their equation systems and solve it, okay? And they'd have to solve it by hand, of course. But secondly, some of it is not even able to be stated statistically. Some of it's just tacit knowledge that's in the minds of the various producers, the various entrepreneurs. Stephen Jobs couldn't explain to a socialist planner why exactly a personal computer or a Mac will be useful to the consumers and so on, or to business. Okay, you need more than statistical data. You have to talk to all of these people, and that would just be impossible. Also, even if the data were collected, if you get everything, the system of equations back in the 1930s could not be solved because there was no computers. Okay. And even if you could solve the system of equations, it would take so long that, let's say you solved it after a year. By that time, everything has changed, and you need to collect new data. So that was the first response. Okay, the market socialism, and one other thing Hayek said about market socialism is the following. Okay, if you want to play with these prices and not solve the equation system, but tell managers to just adjust to the prices that you're raising and lowering, keep in mind that these prices, how often are you going to change these prices? The market changes prices every moment, okay? Prices change every moment. How many times a month is it going to be feasible to change these prices? How long is it going to take you to collect information on whether there's a shortage or scarcity? Right? So, first of all, you're not going to be able to change the prices as frequently as the market, so you're always going to be behind the market. The prices are always going to be wrong in relation to market prices. But secondly, the price changes would not embody all the information, because there's all this other information out there that you need to change prices. What about the fact that, if someone is inventing something new that's going to substitute for steel, you should begin lowering the price of steel now. Okay? You don't know about that until the guy's actually invented it. Whereas the market picks that up right away as people start shifting to this new invention. So that was Hayek's response. And Mises gave an even more fundamental response to the socialists that really crushed them. He says, let's assume the director knew everything. We're going to go further than Hayek. We're going to say that the director knows all of the data that he needs to know. Let's say a board of central planners know all the data. They get together the best scientists and engineers so that they know all the technical knowledge as well as all the individual data about what the available resources are and so on. Even if he knows that, remember, anything that exists today exist because of what? All the buildings, all the factories, they exist because people made decisions to build them years and years ago. Many of those things that exist today are not correct. Many of the plants that were built by GM should not be in existence had they been good forecasters. But the market economy realizes that, and then these plants begin to just be vacated and then allowed to turn into scrap or whatever. But in the case of socialism, Mises points out, you're just going to just use that as data today and just reproduce everything. Okay? There is no way to change what you have today to the more valued state in the future. Because remember, you're always looking towards the future. What are consumers going to want in the future? So you need profits and losses. You don't just need prices. You need to be able to calculate profits and losses to determine how to change, not only how to produce consumer goods, but how to change the capital goods that are in existence today. There is no guide for the planners with a mathematical solution about how to change your capital goods. That's taken as given and it's put into the equations, okay? But they're the wrong capital goods. Many goods should not have been produced. A lot of the railroads should have been laid. A lot of, many planes, there's overcapacity in the airline industry. So many planes, given what's happening today and in the future, shouldn't have been produced, okay? But you're going to take the planes that exist and put them into the equations. It's going to give you a result that's not optimal in terms of the quantities and prices. And then Mises also said, and I'll quickly here, that what if, on the other hand, you knew the future and you wanted to get to the future? Even if you know the future state, you still don't have profits. Now, the reason why you don't have and profits is what drives the economy towards future efficiency and so on, or towards production that's efficient from the point of view of consumers. Mises basically said that the distinctive mark of socialism is not one of lacking knowledge, but it's one will acting. Only one will acts. When one will acts, one person owns everything, that person cannot generate a real price system. And that's the key. A real price system with meaningful prices. He called the market socialism, he says it's a contradiction in terms. If you have socialism, there can be no market. If you have a market, there cannot be socialism. And he said it's a child's game. He says you may, instead of playing with prices, raising them and lowering them, and without having all the information and everything else, without knowing what capital goods you should be producing, is just like picking them out of a hat. Okay, it doesn't change anything because who is setting the prices? In any situation, it's one person setting the prices. There is no true exchange setting those prices, and that's the problem with market socialism. Okay, I will end here. Thank you.